So in this video, I'm going to do something a little bit different than I usually do on the channel. I'm going to take you through a real capabilities deck. We'll go through it slide by slide, and I'll talk a little bit about what's working and what's not. And then be sure to stick around until the end because I'm going to show you guys a quick look at how I would redesign the first few slides in this deck to really make it more compelling, more exciting to look at, and able to close more clients. So let's get into it. So for the purposes of this exercise, I kind of blacked out the name of the agency so we can really focus, less on them and more on the design, the content, and some of the kind of do's and don'ts that I see them doing. So to start with, and I mean, obviously, if you've checked out my channel, you guys know that I don't like how most capabilities decks start. And this is a case where I don't like how this deck starts. So instead of having, influencer marketing agency, consultancy, capabilities, presentation, and kind of all these arrows, all these little artifacts all around the side, I would prefer that the opening cover page just have the dream outcome of the prospect right here, front and center, and then maybe the logo for the agency. But so all of this copy should pivot to what is the dream outcome for the prospect that they're trying to pitch and that they're trying to win. And so I would kind of flip this completely. And this kind of goes back to the concept of how I really like to stay in the prospects world, especially at the start of the deck. So instead of focusing on your agency, focusing on the prospect. And then again, this arrow, all these little artifacts, the date, none of that is needed. Really just the dream outcome statement for the prospect and your agency logo. So this is their next slide, connecting brands to culture. So to me, this actually would serve as a better opening cover page for the deck. Again, from a design perspective, it is a little bit cluttered and hard to kind of see or focus on, some of the different backgrounds, and the text is a little bit hard to read, but I still think this is a way more compelling opening cover slide. So if anything, I would delete that first slide and start with this slide as the cover page. So next they go into About Us, which, as you know, is another thing that I, don't like to see when I look at capabilities decks. I want to always stay in the prospects world. So essentially I would pivot this slide like towards the end of the deck. Because you really want to start, like I said, in the prospects world, talking about what their problem is, how you can solve it, how you've solved it before. But just from also a design perspective and content perspective, there are a lot of issues here. Again, you have like the arrow, the magnifying glass, and this little hamburger menu in the top. All of that could be deleted. It says our agency division. So you're already talking about the different divisions you have before we even know what you do, the problem that you solve, and how you can help. You have this Goldman Sachs, 10,000 small businesses. There's no context for that. So we don't understand, did you work with Goldman? Are you one of the 10,000 small businesses, like 10,000 small businesses that accomplished or achieved what? So there's really no context for this. And then as far as these stats, I do like that they're calling out some of their big wins, but they're not as clear as I would like them to be. So for example, I would actually lead with 4.5 billion impressions because that's pretty impressive. And this is the biggest number. So I always like to lead with the biggest result first. Then 1,300 plus video activations for campaigns. I'm not sure I understand what they mean by video activations for campaigns. Like they could be talking about 1,300 pieces of content created across all the influencer programs that they've done. So that could use some clarity. And then the clients, brands, studios, agencies, 225 plus. This would essentially be their logo quilt. So in this format, it's super hard to read. You can't really make out a lot of the logos. And I'm a big advocate for having your own standalone logo quilt slide. So I'll talk a little bit about that when I get into kind of the design slides that I did for this agency. But again, this slide should be shifted towards the back of the deck. And then some of the design elements and the pieces of information here should be tweaked. So here then they have a standalone testimonial. So again, I'm never a fan of a standalone testimonial. I always like to have the testimonial right on the page for the case study that the testimonial applies to. So in this case, they would have a case study about the work that they did for Warner Brothers, and then this testimonial would go right on that page. I do like, however, that they have the name of the person that gave the testimonial, their title, and obviously their company. And so if I was redesigning this case study page, I would include the testimonial, and then I would have the headshot of Carlos there to really humanize the words and to, let the prospect understand that there's an actual human being behind the testimonial that has been given. So next, again, more standalone testimonials. So essentially, I would break all of these out onto their respective case study pages. Another thing I always like to do is retype testimonials. So never screenshotting them from social or from your email. If you rewrite them, you're able to really, obviously adjust the formatting, adjust the font, and make it blend much better with your design. So just another thing to think about, when I see these screenshotted testimonials, it's a quick fix to just retype them. There are tons of tools that can pull the text, or you can get it transcribed in ChatGPT. And then you want to kind of reformat those testimonials. And again, here we've lost the person that's giving the testimonial. So the strongest testimonials really are, a powerful quote with a person's name and title and their headshot to really humanize the entire thing. And then again, from a design perspective, I would again lose all this information at the top of the page. So next, we're finally getting into the capabilities. So I'll talk a little bit about how I would reorder these pages when I show my version that I designed for this agency. But another issue here is just, I feel like the capabilities of the wording used is a little bit too complicated and could be simplified a lot. And I think a lot of times agencies like to use big words or jargon or make what they do seem, really fancy. But I've always found that clarity, simple language, simple wording, and copy goes a really long way. So, brand strategy and culture integration, again, culture integration that could be left up for interpretation. Even brand strategy, I feel like that's implied in all work that agencies do. So I don't even love to use those words. I think they're very overused and they're kind of nebulous. So I would probably strike that capability altogether. Then influencer marketing and social growth. So that's a great one. That's super clear. And based on what I know from this agency, that is really the main thing that they offer. So I would be making that front and center. And as their, if anything, the only real capability that they list, with the other ones being kind of like sub capabilities. But I like influencer marketing and social growth. Omni-channel creator integration. Again, I think that that's too complicated. I understand what they're trying to get at here, but A, that overlaps a lot with influencer marketing and social growth. And B, I just don't think omni-channel creator integration is the clearest way to state what you're doing there. And again, you want to be as clear as possible. Celebrity and co-creation partnerships. Again, this could easily just be celebrity partnerships. I understand where they're going with co-creation, but I don't think it's necessary at this stage when you're just presenting initially what you do. So I wouldn't necessarily have the co-creation in there. I would just have like celebrity partnerships, and then industry events and management consulting. So to me, those two don't really go together. And industry events and management consulting honestly are their own disciplines in and of themselves. So I would think really critically about whether you even want to include that. Are you world class at industry events and management consulting? If not, I would really focus in your capabilities on what you're really world class at. And I don't mind a culture-led influencer marketing and consulting agency. I think that's pretty clear. But again, when you start to use the word culture a lot and like culture-led, that gets very nebulous. And I feel like a lot of agencies use that word and can kind of claim that they're culture-led. So I would think through what specific differentiators or words you could use there to really kind of differentiate yourself from other agencies in the space. So next we go, I guess, into kind of more services. So full service influencer marketing and social channel growth. So to me, this is kind of their core service, as I mentioned on the last slide. So to me, when it's at capabilities, I would really be more so focused on this slide as opposed to some of the other kind of bubbles that were on there. So we provide end-to-end influencer marketing solutions for both tentpole and always on activations, ensuring your brand social channels are built out. So generally, I like that. I think, again, tentpole can get a little jargony. Obviously, in the marketing agency world, we know what that means. But, I would try to keep it really simple, like one-off and always on activations, or something that anyone could really understand, even if they're not in the agency space. And then I like, that they're kind of listing these bubbles of like brand audience to talent community matching, social media strategy, brand channels. That one is a little bit nebulous. So I would clean up what goes under kind of full service influencer marketing and social growth. So, I like, reporting and measurement, that's clear. Content management and production is clear. So anyway, thinking critically about how can you clearly kind of state what goes under, full service influencer marketing. And then I would formatted like this from a design perspective. I would probably have it a lot more clear just as like a list and or across the page with one straight line. So you can kind of see how the influencer marketing service kind of progresses through each step. And then also from a design perspective, I see more screenshots. They're very difficult to read. They're low resolution. There are tons of ways that you can present data, and maybe in another video I'll talk about it on this channel. But I would think really critically about what to show here and how you can kind of get across influencer marketing and social growth with more powerful, easy to kind of view visuals. Because again, we can barely read these metrics. There's nothing like a trend that's happening. That this does show that they use tracking and tools to kind of look at metrics and analyze, their campaigns and things. But, there are a lot of more clear ways that you could say that. And I also think that essentially, if you just said that, it would be more powerful in this instance than showing these graphics on the right side. So next, they finally bring in a case study. So I'm obviously a big advocate, if you watch my channel, bringing in case studies way earlier, typically within the first 5 slides in your deck. So there's some things I do like and I don't like about this slide. I do like that they're calling out the results. So the 36 million impressions, 8.7% engagement rate, 9 plus creators, 14 content. So that's a typo. 14 pieces of content, something like that, just to kind of make it match everything else. But so I like that they're calling out the results. I do think that this needs to be fully restructured. I would focus more on the visuals on this slide. Like, what were the actual pieces of content that you created? Anyone looking at this deck is going to be less inclined to kind of read the text. This is true across all decks. Are less inclined to kind of read the text and more inclined to like look at the visuals. Look at videos. So anything you have visually is a big win. I don't mind that they're calling out the hashtag. I think that that's interesting, and it kind of shows on Instagram that they did get that 36 million impressions. So it kind of reinforces and validates the impressions that they have on the slide. So I think that's good. But in general, I have a very specific way I do case studies. I'll show you a case study that I did for this agency at the end of the video. But I think, they could clean up the language. They could make it a lot more benefit focused. And they could make, the visuals pop a lot more so that any prospect who's looking at this is immediately drawn into the work that they did and the content that they created. Another cool thing they could do is to show the 9 creators. I think a lot of times, that can be really powerful to just show, who you have access to, who you're working with, et cetera. So just some little things that they can do to kind of punch up this slide and make it more exciting. So same thing with this case study. I don't love the font. There's some font issues with the Cash App times Visa being super big. It's kind of spread out. The line spacing is off. So some of the similar issues to the previous slide, but I do like, again, that they're calling out the results front and center. And I do like that they kind of screenshotted this trending topic for Cash App America. So just revalidate that it was trending. We pulled the screenshot when it was trending. I think there are cool ways to clean up screenshots. There's a tool called Zapper. It's xnapper.com. That's a really cool screenshotting tool. So anyway, that's design wise how they could clean this up a little bit. And then again, I would focus way more on the content. What are the videos? Something people can press play on so that they're drawn into the work you did, the videos you did, and kind of hearing and seeing the influencers at work that you work with. So next, brand strategy and culture integration. So this is a subpage for one of the capabilities they mentioned before. I honestly would scrap this entire page. If anything, like for social listening and culture mapping, brand safety and vetting guidelines, like all of these bullets are cool and important. And I would put those on that initial capability slide. So, essentially that slide would become kind of like our services, and like whichever ones of these bullets in these bubbles could apply to influencer marketing, I would put on that page, but I would lose the brand strategy and culture integration altogether. And I would also probably lose the We Translate audience insights into group. A lot of that is pretty general. All social media marketing and influencer marketing agencies do that. So it's not really special. And then even with these graphics here on the left, they don't really lend anything to the type of work that this agency does. So I would get rid of them, this whole page in general. Again, another case study. I have the same feedback here. It needs to be cleaned up. The fonts need to be cleaned up. It needs to be focused on the content. And then again, I don't really love screenshotted social sentiment or testimonials. I think it's much better to kind of retype that. And I'll show some examples of that when I get to the deck I'm going to show you at the end. Same thing with this case study. And then obviously, because, this involves The Rock, I would kind of make him front and center, make his video big, maybe even kind of put his headshot on there and talk a little bit about how he was involved, since obviously he's a celebrity. And this can reinforce the celebrity partnerships piece that was mentioned on their capabilities. So similar changes, but, you always want to play up, any kind of big talent or celebrity talent or recognizable names or brands to just lend that credibility and build that trust with the prospect. So here they talk about celebrity and co-creator partnerships. So this slide is throwing me off a little bit just because I haven't really seen, aside from The Rock, any of the work that they did with any of these big names. So, rather than kind of have them here on this page, I would rather see the case studies that show, when they worked with, especially if you have someone like a Tom Cruise or Will Smith, we want to see the work that you did with those people. We want to see, the content that was created with those people or however they were involved. And then on those case studies, you can put their headshot and talk about how they were involved. And that's going to be a much more powerful way to reinforce kind of the celebrity partnerships piece, and that you have access to these celebrities. And I did notice that they had like athletes and NIL on that About Us page. again, I would bring in that angle through the case studies. And if you want to, for example, group some of the NIL case studies so you can talk about that as one of your strengths as a business, I think that works. But up to this point, we haven't really seen any sports focused or NIL focused case studies. So I would essentially, again, take this page out, and then any of the bullets, retail product co-creation. That's a way more clear way of talking about co-creation. It implies that they work with celebrities to partner with brands to come up with retail products. So again, these bullets that are important here would go back on that original capabilities page. And so if you have, influencer marketing, end-to-end influencer marketing, it would have those bullets. Celebrity partnerships, it would have these bullets, et cetera, so that you're bringing all the capabilities onto one page instead of spreading them out. This also makes the deck a lot longer. For example, we're on page 13 of 25, so the deck is already getting pretty long. Another case study, I would clean this one up in the same way. This does have some talent. I see, David Beckham, Alicia Keys, et cetera. So again, I like that they're screenshotting the content that was created with those celebrities, but I would actually have the video integrated into the deck, using a tool like pitch.com so that they can play the videos, they can see it in action. And then, you could even have the headshots of the main talent that worked on this project or this case study. I do like that they pulled the Variety press hit right here. Again, any kind of press you can include is going to help validate what you're saying. But one thing I will say about this case study is, this is showing 8.5 million impressions. And I feel like if you're working with talent at this level, David Beckham, Alicia Keys, et cetera, there's a disconnect between working with people that big and then having such a small number of impressions. So that can be addressed by really just talking about what was the project, how were these celebrities involved? Maybe the celebrities weren't posting to their channels, but you need to kind of clarify that in the whole story of the case study, because a prospect who sees this is going to be thinking, just one of those people has hundreds, of millions of followers. So, why are you only getting 8.5 million impressions? So a lot of that just has to do with the storytelling in the case study. I'll link below my slide-by-slide capabilities deck guide. It's a great free resource you can use to understand slide-by-slide how to structure your deck and what to put on each page. And I go really deep into case studies and how to kind of format those properly. And so, a case study like this could benefit from kind of being restructured and punching up the storytelling. Again, another case study, similar here, we have talent involved, Ruby Rose, Bow Wow, et cetera. So I would, again, do the same thing as far as, highlighting the content so that it plays natively in the deck, and then highlighting those celebrities with their headshots and really clarifying the full storyline here. And then again, so this is another one of those pages where they broke out industry event, showcase event, strategy seminars. So, I see now here that they have like a creator pitch house. So essentially it looks like they train or do workshops or sessions at brands to kind of train brands on social media marketing and influencer marketing. So not that you can't include that in your deck, but essentially I would add this as like a later kind of add-on page, like plus we do this as opposed to one of our core capabilities, because most of the prospects coming to them are going to be brands or people that want influencer marketing campaigns versus or that are going to want their team or their staff trained on influencer marketing. So essentially, because this is such a different offering, I think it can be a cool differentiator to show, that they know what they're doing to the point where they're being hired to really train brands and teams on this stuff. But I would kind of push it to the end of the deck and make it almost like a bonus add-on, be like, and if you're interested, we can also come into your brand, come into your business and kind of help educate your team on best practices of influencer marketing and social growth. So again, I would pull this out. I wouldn't list this as one of their main capabilities. Essentially, this would be like a value added add-on at the end. And then so these examples of those sessions could be matched up with that slide at the end. And maybe you do one page that kind of groups these case studies onto one page, or you could do each one individually. But essentially, this wouldn't be a part of the core pitch. This would be like a separate section that they could use in their deck if they feel like it's a good fit for the prospect that they're pitching. And just bring this in, an additional 4 slides that really talks about these sessions. And again, I would clean up a lot of the design. I would integrate video natively. I wouldn't screenshot these images. I would bring each one in individually so you can kind of move them around. Again, the fonts are off. I would, anything like a logo should be on a transparent background. I'm personally a fan of one tone, monotone logos. So, this would be, changing this to all black on a transparent background for both of these to just bring some uniformity to the page. I wouldn't have these next sessions because again, your deck is kind of like an evergreen document. So you don't want to really like date it. This is something you could speak to in the room though, that you have sessions coming up, or maybe there's a link to kind of click to see their upcoming schedule of sessions on their website. So a lot of different ways I would clean this up. And then for all of these case studies, as opposed to listing like creators and their following, I always like to put headshots so that they're just more visuals on the page. Your viewer is going to connect more with visuals of the people, as opposed to just listing their name and their following. And even with these visuals, you can link out to their social channels so that if somebody's really interested in this piece and who you worked with, they can click the headshot. It links out to their Instagram, and now they're learning even more about that person. Are they big talent? How did you work with them? So just ways to make these pages a lot more engaging. And I do like that they highlighted the topics here. I don't think they need these special bullets. These could just be simple bullets. And if anything, there could be a separate page that talks about some of the topics that they discuss at these sessions or workshops. So this is almost like a separate offering. In a perfect world, this is a separate pitch deck that they're taking to companies or brands that are looking for in-house influencer marketing and social media training. But for the purposes of this video, I would group these to the end and kind of have these as a plus. We also do this if it were to live in their main capabilities deck. And then omni-channel creator integration. So again, this is where I would have put this on that initial kind of capabilities page. So under, omni-channel creator integration, which I would title differently. I would put full funnel strategy development, paid and social amplification, programming and CTV, and then experiential activations. But one thing to notice about this is that they don't really have any case studies that support these services. So it's really important that on your capability slide that shows like our services, that you have case studies that support the services that you're listing there. So if they do have case studies that show, that they can execute paid media campaigns or experiential activations, I would encourage them to kind of bring those case studies into the deck. And that will help strengthen that this is one of their core services and that they're really world-class at doing this. Again, another case study. This is actually the one that I redesigned in the deck I'm going to show you shortly, but similar thing here. I would, embed the content, retype testimonials, clean up the story. I don't think you need Julie and CVS and then the logos. Then it also talks about annual influencer programming as kind of like what they did for this client. But then when you look at the visuals, it's more about like this, at least the top visuals are about like this creator who landed their first ever brand deal with Julie. So, I think there's a disconnect between who is the client, what was their goal, what were they looking for to get out of this? And, from what I see, it says partnership goal, awareness, and retail purchases. So all of the visuals, all of the social sentiment and quotes should be focused on how Julie got more awareness and more retail purchases versus, for example, this influencer that landed, the deal with Julie. And I mean, I see why they included it because it's like a press hit. So essentially, Julie is getting awareness through the story that this influencer is telling about landing this brand deal. But, I'll show you how I designed this page. But essentially, I would really kind of de-emphasize that part because ultimately, the big impressions that they were getting, was based on partnering with the 35 creators, and getting great content pushed out through those creator channels. And again, positive sentiment, 80%, that's a great one. So again, all that sentiment is going to be found in the creators that are pushing that content out on their channel. So I would focus more on the content that was created, the channels that it lived on, the level of influencers that they were working with, and kind of the likes and shares and all the metrics around, social media marketing and awareness online. So that's how I would adjust this case study. Similar to this one, again, now this one is interesting because, obviously the social impressions are slightly down. The 50K new fast channel views, I'm assuming that applies to Reverie TV, which is like a TV channel. So again, there should be no confusion about, what happened with this case study. It does say increased awareness and viewership for Reverie, Samsung TV, and Roku users. So again, I would just rewrite that to be super, super clear. Like Reverie TV increased their viewership by XYZ over XYZ time period. So, again, like I mentioned, I'll link below the guide that I have. That's like a slide-by-slide capabilities that guide. It talks a lot about how to format case studies and how to storytell with your case studies. But the key is just to be as clear as you possibly can when you are drafting case studies. And while I'm on the subject, typically I like to include max 5 case studies, maybe a few more if you really do need to kind of show some different examples because maybe you do different types of work or for your agency. But, even in this deck, like a lot of the, you could have probably stopped at 3 to 5 case studies max. So just picking the ones that pack the most punch and putting them in, and that will also keep the length of the deck shorter. And then another case study here, Soul App. Again, I'm not quite clear what the goal was for the brand. I'm assuming they wanted to get more users on the platform, but I'm not 100% So again, storytelling, clarifying, join the metaverse at like I'm not clear on what the goal was for the client and then how they executed on that goal. And then they actually had the duplicate about us page. So that's like a error in their deck that they have this page duplicated twice. But this is actually where I would put the about us page because, once you've talked about what you do, how you can help them and shown examples in the case studies, then you can get over to, about you. Now they're kind of bought in. Maybe they want to work with you. Now you can talk about us and kind of some of your bigger accolades. And then finally, I kind of blacked out, their logo and their contact information, but I do like that at the end, they just have schedule a strategy call. My only change here is I wouldn't put an email address. I would have a booking link to my calendar so that they can click schedule a strategy call and they go right directly to your calendar to book in. So I talk about this with decks all the time. You want to have one clear CTA that they can click on. You don't want to include your website, your email address, your address, all these different, social links. You don't want a ton of different links on this page. You just want them to take one concrete next step. And so you want to just have one clickable link. And I always prefer that it's something where they just click, input their information and hit submit versus like an email address where now they have to copy your email address. They have to draft an email to you. They have to think up what to say or how to start the conversation. So that just adds friction to the process. So yeah, I like that this page is simple. I would just have schedule a strategy call with a booking link to their calendar. And then, again, I would remove all of these other elements from the border of the page. So yeah, that's me walking through kind of step by step, slide by slide, what I would change and what I would keep in terms of this deck. And now I'll show you guys how I redesigned the first few pages of this deck in a way that I feel like is a lot more compelling and is a lot more kind of like pitch ready and exciting for potential prospects to look at. And so this is an example of how I would redesign the first few pages of the deck for this agency. So again, just leading with the dream outcome for prospects that they're pitching. So we make Gen Z and millennials actually give a damn about your brand with influencer marketing campaigns that actually boost sales. So from the start, we're calling out what they want. This agency had mentioned that they really are focused on Gen Z and millennials. So, this is about diving right in, calling out those groups so that any prospect who's interested in targeting those groups, they see them right here. They want them to care about their brand. So we're calling that out. And then influencer marketing campaigns that actually boost sales, which is ultimately, what any prospect who's working with them would be interested in. So this is how I would start the deck. This next page goes right into the problem statement. And again, I always talk about this on my channel, but you want to stay in the prospect's world. You want to talk about their problem. And once you do that, it kind of starts to build that trust because they begin to understand that you understand their problem and you know how to solve it. So, here's the uncomfortable truth. Gen Z and millennials don't care about your brand. They care about the creators they follow, the memes they share, and the personal brand they're building online. You can keep buying traditional ads that get scrolled past, or you can meet them where they actually are in the comments, the DMs, and the For You pages. So just talking about, you understand Gen Z and millennials, you understand the issue for brands right now that are trying to connect with these groups. And again, the visuals are engaging. They're easy to see. They're clear. They're tied back to what the slide is talking about. And then, the good news, you don't need to understand the algorithm. You just need to work with people who do. So this is where you start to bring in, again, with powerful visuals, but what you do, the world that you live in as an agency, it's in social, it's with influencers, it's vibrant, it's bright, it's also product focused, it's sales focused, etc. And then, so this is where I would bring in the what we do, which is, our services slide. So we aren't your typical send product, get post shop. We're the bridge between brands that have budgets and the chaotic, brilliant, unpredictable world of internet culture. So again, you're connecting with the brand and saying, we understand this world so that you don't have to, and still kind of connecting with them on the fact that it is chaotic, but it is a really amazing world where, brands need to live in order to sell a lot of products. Also, as you can see on the top right, visuals that are showing influencers at work, and then also calling out 250 plus brand and influencer collaboration so that they're already getting a sense that this agency knows what they're doing. And so what I wanted to do with the bottom was to talk about the kind of two pillars of what this agency does. So one pillar is the creating of content. So that's the create side. And then one piece is the amplifying of content. So, the cross-channel media buying. So I kind of took the services and the capabilities that they had previously listed and try to kind of regroup and restructure them in a way that I thought would be more interesting and more exciting and clear for prospects. So, end-to-end influencer campaign management, that's pretty clear with a little blurb about what that's about. Celebrity and athlete partnerships. And then again, calling out these celebrities right on the opening page here so they can see the caliber of celebrities that this agency has worked with. And then on the amplify side, cross-channel media buying. So, essentially you're creating content with these influencers and celebrities and athletes. And then we can also help you amplify it with cross-channel media buying. And if you remember, they had used like omni-channel To me, cross channel is a little bit easier to understand. So again, just kind of simplifying the language down a little bit can be really helpful. And then I love to bring in a logo quote. So I don't know if you remember, they had kind of like the small section with all of the logos in it. This is how I would flip that, and really bring kind of the logos front and center. They worked with some really great brands. So let's show that. Let's use that as credibility to build trust with prospects. And then I immediately call out who we work with. So brands that want to win the internet, not just participate in it, from Fortune 500s that need to remember how to be cool to scrappy startups that need to look bigger than they are. If you're launching a product, rebranding your business, or trying to win Gen Z and millennial eyeballs, we're your team. So quick, short, to the point. You really want your prospect to raise their hand and say, that's me. And then obviously they will be impressed, by all these great logos that this agency has worked with, front and center, easy to see, clear, with obviously a powerful visual behind it. And so this was a case study I talked about that I was going to redesign. And I want to talk a little bit about this because I think case studies are so important. And I did want it to be, bright, vibrant. Obviously you see there's content on here, 3 different videos that you can play. I'm calling out the metrics for those videos. So tons of plays, tons of likes, comments, shares. So you're getting a sense that this content is engaging, it's out there in the real world, drumming up real interest and awareness. So what you really want to do here is call out, not just the work and the likes and the impressions, but really summarizing what was important to Julie, the client that hired them. And so I like to do that in the headline, which is making Julie the emergency contraception brand Gen Z actually talks about. So again, Julie, that's what they wanted. They wanted to be the talk of the town as far as emergency contraception for Gen Z. And so we're calling that out in the headline. And then, if the prospect wants to dive deeper, they can read about, Julie is a newly launched emergency contraceptive. So they can read kind of what the challenge was. They can read what the role of the agency was. But essentially, what they're really going to be attracted to is the visuals on the page. And so in this case, I really wanted to call out a few key things to really support what work they did for Julie and kind of some of the big business impacts that happened. So for example, 180 million plus impressions across TikTok, Instagram, and Hulu. That's obviously a big deal. They wanted awareness. They wanted kind of traction in the social space, and they got 180 million plus impressions. Then 80% positive sentiment, another one calling that out. So that's showing that the work that they did with these influencers was received really well online. And then, as I mentioned, I always like to retype, these quotes and the testimonials and social sentiment. So I kind of put those in the white boxes. So best ad I've ever seen. Good job, you, and good job, Julie, for hiring you. This is fabulous. Love your account and love Julie. So just showing some of that positive sentiment. And then I even have the quote down at the bottom. I remember being a kid and you had to be 18 plus to purchase emergency contraceptives, and you had to purchase it from behind the pharmacy counter. Ridiculous. So glad it's so easily accessible these days. And I did include that username, and said via TikTok. So again, just different ways to show what people were saying, how they were commenting. That longer quote kind of talks about how, the movement and what they were doing with the influencers was really, really impactful. And then as you can see up in the top right corner, it's top performing CPC campaign to date. So again, calling out some of the big wins about this campaign. You can see these little view on TikToks that link out. So this is a great way to just, show that these are real campaigns that really went live. They can click through to these and really verify that, this was live on TikTok. They did get 51 million views or plays. So again, you really want to validate that anytime you can by, putting links like this out to, where I call it in the wild, where it lives out in the wild in the real world. And then again, you can press play with sound, for people who want to actually hear the content, see the content, understand the content, this one as well. And so this is how I would essentially redesign the pages, the first few pages for this agency to just, again, make the deck more compelling, make it more exciting to look at, and make it build a lot more of that trust and credibility that you really need to win. So, if you're interested in having me audit your deck or do a kind of review like this on your deck, join my school community. There's a link down in the description below. That's primarily where I'm going to be pulling these decks from, where you can kind of connect with me and submit your deck to see if it's a good fit for the channel. And if this was helpful and you want to learn more ways to level up your capabilities deck, check out this video where I talk about the importance of adding verifiable proof to your deck, similar to this case study that I just showed you. It's one of the #1 ways to level up your pitch and to make hiring your agency the obvious choice.